So we're going to end with some final thoughts about the impact of the Reformation. One area that was impacted by the Reformation was education. The focus of the reformers was on the authority of the Word of God and on making this available to all Christians. And so this led to the Bible being translated into the languages of Europe. But if the Bible was to be available to read, then people had to know how to read. Language in the Bible in your language is pointless if you can't read it. So universal literacy became something to be aimed at. This translation of the Bible also had an impact on language. It meant that a significant work, and with it a significant number of words, were written in the vernacular. And so the vernacular had to be stabilised in meaning and spelling to enable the Bible to be translated successfully. When Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, he gave the German states a common form of their language to refer to, even though it was based on one particular dialect of the time. Another clear impact of the Reformation is on the politics. If you remember when I was talking about the period between 1530 and 1555, it was becoming clear to princes that they could, and perhaps should at times, resist the superior authority of the emperor. The impact of this was felt in England during the Civil War, when Parliament decided it should resist the superior authority of the king, and in time in France and in America. The development of republicanism in Europe was underpinned by this. The other aspect was that in emphasising the priesthood of all believers, the reformers gave a value to all vocations. No longer were clergy and monks seen as superior to other Christians, but instead each in their vocation and ministry would serve as equals. And this, of course, sat well with those cities who had an elected council. And so it was something that was built on and encouraged. Another thing that came out of the Reformation was the idea that challenging received authority could be taken beyond theology to other areas of life. Medics could critique the work of the Greeks, since actually they didn't fit with the reality they saw before them as they were dealing with human bodies. They worked out the Greeks had thought about what ought to be the case in the body, rather than actually finding out for themselves what it was actually like. An openness to learning from new sources led to the possibility of experimental science. And so we get to Francis Bacon in the 17th century, and the development, often among Anglican clergy, of experimental science. There was a major impact on art of the Reformation. The attitude to art differed between the Lutheran and the Reformed movements. While both were concerned about the worshipping of statues, they felt this could be resolved in different ways. Reformed thinking went for very austere churches without art. This is where in England we get the whitewashing of the walls. Stained glass was removed, and the 10 Commandments were renumbered. They were numbered, in fact, in a way in which they had been numbered in the Septuagint. But in the numbering, you got a separation out of thou shalt have no other gods before me, and thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. Now we're used to that because the prayer book was influenced by Martin Bucer, who came over and worked on it with Cranmer. And Martin Bucer was a Reformed theologian. So this emphasis on not having a graven image, although it's there in the Lutheran and the Catholic versions, it's not as emphasised by having it as a separate commandment. In Lutheran areas, art was still to be valued in the church. The Wittenberg church had a new altarpiece And this showed, instead of a separation of the ordained and the special, the disciples at the Last Supper are gathered round together. We see the baptism on the left. That is the source of our ministry, is we're baptised together. Reformed areas, the church was no longer a patron of the visual arts, and so the artists either took commissions in Catholic areas or developed a more secular style altogether to appeal to nobility who could afford to give them work. But meanwhile, the Counter-Reformation encouraged art in churches, and this is where we get the beginning of the Baroque style developing. And certainly it develops in the early 17th century, aiming to communicate religious themes with emotion. And so you'll see on the screen now the Church of St. Ignatius of Loyola in Rome, with 3 frescoes around the high altar, 17th century works of the Jesuit Andrea Pozzo. Another impact was on music. One of the biggest innovations in Lutheran worship was the use of congregational singing. Before this, singing was the work of a choir of monks and included plain chant and the singing of anthems. But Luther wrote hymns to communicate his ideas, set them to popular tunes. You would sing them in church and then you'd sing them for the rest of the week. How often have you found that you remember the hymns from Sunday far more than you remember the content of the sermon? So compare these two pieces. The Reformed areas resisted non-biblical hymns, but metrical psalms were permitted, and so we have the Old Hundredth. Finally, we're going to think about church architecture. Compare a 14th century church, such as this one, to a 16th century church. What is different? And why?